Hi everyone, and welcome to Autistic Changeling. The lighting might be a little bit wonky for today's video because it's not as bright outside and I'm not getting as much natural lighting, but I think we'll all make do. So today I want to talk about diagnosis. It's kind of a large topic and I'm probably going to overlook some things I meant to talk about, but we'll see what happens. First, I want to talk about my experience with searching for and obtaining a diagnosis, because I do have an official diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder specifically, and also generalized anxiety. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about diagnosis. So I didn't get diagnosed until my third year of college. At that point I had been specifically looking for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder for about a year and a half, because I had started suspecting I was autistic, and that's when I started actually talking to people and looking for a diagnosis, and we'll get there, but this actually starts way earlier than that. So my first experience seeing someone who probably should have been diagnosing me with something but wasn't, was when I was a child and I was having sleep issues, and we went to see a therapist about it, just this one session, and she said, "Your problem is that you think too much. I wish I had that problem." And let me just say right now that I don't think telling your patients you wish you had their problem is a good tactic to take as a therapist. And also, if my problem is that I think too much, like, it was anxiety, okay? It was anxiety. But that's more of an amusing anecdote than anything that's directly relevant. So, apparently, and I don't remember this because I wasn't really involved in these conversations, but apparently at least one person had actually approached my mom when I was a child and asked if she thought that I might be autistic. And at the time, nobody really knew a great deal about autistic traits, and my mom just kind of brushed it off as, oh, they're quirky. You know, I was homeschooled as a kid, so it was really easy to brush off anything weird about me as, oh yeah, that's what homeschoolers are like. And also, you know, a weird family kind of a thing. So anything that was a weird or unusual thing about me as a kid was pretty easy to dismiss. And it wasn't really until we moved from Canada to the US and I started going to public school that it became more noticeable to me that no, I wasn't actually just weird. There was like something going on. But I suspected before. I always knew that I was a little bit different than everybody else. I just, you know, when you're a kid, you're like, oh, I'm secretly a fairy. I think I touched on that in my last video. But once I started in high school, it became a little bit more obvious that, like, there's probably a word for this that I don't know. And, you know, I took AP psychology, and they get to the section on mental disorders, and I'm like reading through the different summaries and hoping something will seem familiar and click. Nothing did, because they were badly written summaries. So I didn't really start getting answers until way after AP Psych. But yeah, it wasn't until I think sophomore year of college that my mom brought it up to me that, you know, for a while when I was a kid, she thought I might be autistic. And I started looking into it again, and things started making sense. You know, I talked with mom, and I talked with the therapist I was seeing at the time, who was a grad student doing therapy at a place that was on campus, but not officially associated with the campus, because the campus had its own separate mental health thing, and they kind of competed with each other a little bit. So I talked to her, and it was... So they all agreed that I was autistic. However, the therapist I was seeing didn't have the authority to really say for sure. All she could tell me was, like, you might be, because she couldn't officially technically say anything more than that. So she started trying to arrange an assessment with the people on campus who actually officially did all that stuff. And that assessment is how I actually got diagnosed. But in the meantime, because this process took way longer than I would have expected it to take, in the meantime, I also saw a couple of other therapists. And here's where it gets into a story, capital S. So this was over the summer because the sophomore year of school had ended, and this is over the summer after that. So I haven't heard back from the people that my therapist has supposedly contacted to help me get a diagnosis. So I figure, well, I'll go see some people myself, see if I can expedite this a little bit. So I see this one therapist, and I'm going to talk about some red flags when you're seeing therapists. First of all, I would, in general, try to stay away from anybody who constantly compares you to their children or their nephews. This therapist kept comparing me to her autistic nephew, and it was kind of uncomfortable. I'm not your nephew. I'm not really comfortable being compared to your nephew. It was like she wasn't sharing personal anecdotes or anything. She was just like, "Oh, you're more high functioning than my nephew," and she told me this like several times, but like it wasn't relevant. It wasn't helpful. It was just kind of uncomfortable because autistic people are different. I'm going to make a separate video at some point about functioning labels. Suffice to say, I don't like them. And all of that aside, it's just. It wasn't helpful in any way. It didn't serve any purpose. And also, she just, I don't know. I talked to her and I said, I think I'm autistic. I'd like to, talk about this more, see if I can get a diagnosis, if, you agree. My mom was there to help provide information on when I was a kid. We went through the diagnosis criteria. She didn't seem to fully understand the diagnostic criteria, to be honest. I think I had a better grasp of autistic traits than her at that point because I had been researching and she probably didn't deal with a whole lot of autistic people. And that's one of the reasons, honestly, why I do support self-diagnosis, because I definitely have interacted with a lot of mental health professionals who don't know as much about autism as I do, because I am autistic and I've done a lot more research in it than they have, because they have to know about a lot of different types of mental health stuff, and I don't. I just have to know about the things that affect me. So I, at that point, probably did understand the diagnostic criteria better than her specifically. This is not to say I understand it better than everybody out there, but compared to this one therapist who maybe wasn't actually super familiar with all of this, yeah, I don't know how well she understood it. She couldn't really explain the criteria that basically boils down to stimming to me, because I had a question about it and she seemed pretty lost. So anyways, that was this one experience that honestly left me feeling kind of confused, because in the end, she did tell me that she had diagnosed me, but like she didn't give me any paperwork. There was no way that I could prove it to the university if I needed accommodations. There was no way for me to have this documented anywhere. And what I really wanted when I was looking for a diagnosis was for some kind of written official confirmation that someone who knew what they were doing had agreed with me that I'm autistic, and I could use that documentation if I ever had to be like, look, I am autistic, here's the written proof. I really wanted that written proof, both for validation that, I wasn't just making all of this up, that someone else out there who knew what they were doing had agreed with me, and also for practical purposes if I needed accommodations. And I didn't get that from this person in either sense. I didn't feel like she knew what she was doing enough that I trusted her, and I also did not get any written documentation at all. So that was one thing. I also went to see a psychiatrist over the same summer who said that I seemed autistic, but that he didn't believe in diagnosis, which confused me a little bit, because there are valid reasons to criticize the concept of diagnosis, but also it's a thing that exists. And it just felt kind of dismissive of my experiences, and he also gave me some information which my doctor later told me was not accurate about my medication. So, yeah, I'm a little suspicious of therapists sometimes. But the therapist that I actually was seeing primarily when I was at university was wonderful, and she did eventually contact the people who were in charge of all this, and I did eventually get in to see them, and them I trusted. It was more what I had been expecting when I was looking for a diagnosis, with, you know, paperwork that I would fill out about sensory issues and executive function and things for my mom to fill out about when I was a kid, and I was in there, and there were tests where they had this whole, I don't know if I'm supposed to say too much about them or like spoilers or whatever, but there were some interactive tests and interviews and such, and in general it seemed a lot more professional and a lot more structured, and that was more what I had been looking for from the beginning. And a couple of months after the sessions were over, they did give me an official written report, which I did use to get accommodations at university. And I haven't needed accommodations at my work, but if I needed to, I could submit that paperwork and get those. And paperwork like that after a set of tests like the ones I took were more what I had been looking for. So that's the story of how I got a diagnosis. Now let's move on to more general discussion here. So I know that the main controversy surrounding the concept of diagnosis tends to be about self-diagnosis. So I do support self-diagnosis. But on the other hand, I didn't feel comfortable with it in terms of myself. If someone else comes to me and says they're autistic, I'm not going to question them. I'm not going to say, oh, you know, show me your diagnostic paperwork. That's creepy, invasive, and honestly inappropriate. If you say you're autistic, I believe you. You know, I think if someone has done the research, talked to other people, you know yourself well enough to say that you're autistic, then that's fine with me. That's all I need to know. But on the other hand, I did not feel comfortable with that, both because I didn't feel like I could really be certain of myself, and also because I didn't want to have to deal with the kinds of crap I see self-diagnosed people getting. I just wasn't comfortable with it from my own perspective. But that's why I think, you know, we can have a variety of people doing a variety of things. I think there's a place for both in the community. There are a lot of valid reasons to not want to get an official diagnosis. Some people are self-diagnosed because they can't get an official diagnosis, but they do want one because they want the confirmation or they want the accommodations that they could get through it. Other people choose to stay self-diagnosed because they don't want an official diagnosis because they're afraid of the repercussions from that, like with healthcare or I think adoption. I'm not specifically certain about what kinds of repercussions, but I know that there are some that people are concerned about if they disclose a diagnosis, and that's fine too. You know, I don't think anyone should be forced to get a diagnosis. If just having that self-knowledge is enough for you, then, you know, why spend the money and time to get something you don't need? But I did need a diagnosis, and I did kind of have to fight to get one with people who didn't think diagnosis was a real thing, or people who just couldn't diagnose me because I didn't have the authority to do so. So I think that, you know, if you need a diagnosis, it should be more easy to get than it currently is. Not in the sense of, like, they should, you know, make it easier to say that someone's autistic, but in the sense that, like, there shouldn't be as many hoops to jump through just to find out what words can be used to describe the way you think about things. I mean, it was so hard just to find someone who would understand what I wanted. I talked to a lot of the time when I would say that I was looking for a diagnosis, I think it confused the people I was talking to. Like, they couldn't understand why my first desire wasn't to be fixed or to look or act neurotypical. It was to understand myself and who I am and how I act. And that desire for self-understanding over change seemed to really confuse people because primarily, you know, what I wanted was first to know where I'm at. And that doesn't seem like a strange thing to me. Maybe it's because I'm an engineering major, and when confronted with a problem, the first thing I want to know is, what is the problem? You can't, I need to know where I am, what I know, what I don't know, what I have, what I don't have. So for me, I did want words right away, because I wanted to know, and that doesn't seem to be something that's really unusual, but it did seem to confuse a lot of mental health professionals. And I think that, in an ideal world, the value of having those words and having access to a community wouldn't be as underestimated as it seems to be in the mental health professionality, whatever. Another thing I want to talk about is the words that we use, and the experience of knowing that there was something going on, but not having the words for it before I was diagnosed. I remember in the early days of looking through the neurodivergent community tags and such, at that time, the debate about whether people who had X condition could use neurodivergent was still very much in play. I think it's died down a little since then, but the debate was still pretty prevalent at that time, and as someone who didn't know even what category of what I was falling into, like at the time, I couldn't have told you, whether I had a developmental disorder or a mental disability or a personality disorder or what. I didn't know. Back then, it made me feel like there was nowhere for me to be, and that's why I'm a strong believer that neurodivergent as a label should be open to anybody who feels that they are neurodivergent. I think that it's important to have words like that for people who don't know what other words they have yet, because having words to describe your experiences is important. Not everybody has to use the words, but to have them available, I think that's important, and I think that matters, even for people who don't have any other words, especially for people who don't have any other words. Yeah, you can hear the rain. It just started raining kind of suddenly. They've been calling for thunderstorms all day. I guess we're finally getting them. So that's most of what I wanted to talk about. I've also seen some people talking about how, in an ideal world, we might not even need the concept of diagnosis, and how the basic fundamental elements of how it works and how it's viewed might change. And I agree to some extent. I think we're always going to need words to describe our experiences, and I think words like autistic would be useful no matter what world we live in. I do think that the need to have a diagnosis written officially on paper so you can get accommodations wouldn't exist in an ideal world, because I think an ideal world would be accessible to everybody, and you wouldn't need to jump through so many hoops just to have access to things. I think accessibility is important, and that, if someone needs... I feel like the way our educational system is structured would have to change pretty drastically for this, by the way. But honestly, that's not really on topic here anymore. I don't know what an ideal world would look like. I just know it's probably not this one. Anyways, that's all I had to say, I guess. If you have any questions or any suggestions for other topics you'd like me to discuss, you can leave them down in the comments. And have a great day.